coordinators of the seminar today. And I'm here to introduce our speaker, Sophie Lewis. I'll say a couple of words about sort of where we are in the arc of our studies. This is the beginning of a 2-session dive into family abolitionist politics as part of our middle segment of revolutionary critiques of the family. Che Gossett introduced family abolition as a concept alongside other abolitionist frameworks last week. Here, let's see, can I unpin you, Wendy?
Yes, I just wanted to before you introduce Sophie, I just wanted to spotlight your upcoming event and a couple others. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, we definitely should do event announcements.
Okay, great. So yeah, just before we get to Sophie, we have a couple upcoming events which I will put in the chat. The soonest being a release celebration and reading and discussion for Emmy's co-authored book, Everything for Everyone, an Oral History of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072. And that's going to be on Sunday, September 4th. I'm just going to put the Eventbrite link in the chat. Where's chat? Here we go. And then also, if you go to the Parapraxis site, which I'll put a link to that as well, you'll see we also have 2 other forthcoming events. One is a talk on the keyword melancholy, and that'll be on September 17th. And that's with Anne Chang, Ranjana Khanna, David Ng, and it's moderated by Jane Hugh. Hold on, let me put that as well in the chat. And then the third is another book release celebration for a book by Donald Moss, who presented in our first session of the series, and his book is Psychoanalysis in a Plague Year. And that is coming at that event will be on October 8th. And he will be joined by TJ Clark, Giuseppe Civitarese, and others. So follow those 2 links, and we'll keep you updated about those events. And yeah, I'll pass it over now to Emmy.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. We're expecting today a turnout just under our threshold of planning to stay in the whole group. So we are currently not planning to do breakout groups and instead end 15 minutes earlier or so. And currently we're doing it week by week based on whether more than 50 people or less than 50 people come, roughly. So we're very excited to have Sophie Lewis here today, who has been a program participant in our seminar series, as well as one of certainly the most important leading intellectuals of critiques of the family, reproductive justice, thinking about communism and gender. So very excited. I a minute ago said this is part of our kind of arc in the seminar, where this middle section is about radical, largely non-psychoanalytic, but not entirely non-psychoanalytic critiques of the family, placing these in dialogue with psychoanalytic critiques. And this is the Che Gossett introduced briefly family abolition as a concept alongside other abolitionisms during our last session. And then this session and our next session in 2 weeks, where Madeline Lane McKinley will talk about my article, and an article by Kathy Weeks will be our sort of real focus on family abolition as a theme. And we were very lucky this time to get early access to Sophie Lewis's book. I hope everyone has pre-ordered it with our discount code. I think the discount code will no longer work after today, but I strongly encourage everyone to pre-order the book if you haven't as well. Hopefully you managed to get a hold of a digital copy. So I'll go ahead and read Sophie's bio and then let them take it away. Sophie Lewis is a writer living in Philadelphia as an Anglo-Franco-German transplant. Her analyses of feminist anti-utopianisms, octopus documentaries, and heterosexual televisual artifacts have in fact been published mainly in the US. Sophie is the author of Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, hailed by Donna Haraway as the seriously radical cry for full gestational justice that I long for. Her second book, Abolish the Family, a Manifesto for Care and Liberation, Grace Lavery describes as charting, quote, a new and necessary course for Marxist feminism. As a member of the faculty of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, Sophie teaches courses on feminist theory, trans and queer politics, and anti-work philosophy, online and open to all. Previously, Dr. Lewis studied English literature and nature, society, and environmental policy at Oxford University, politics at the New School for Social Research, and geography at Manchester University, where she completed a PhD. Writing by Lewis appears in venues ranging from Harper's and Boston Review to the New York Times and London Review of Books, as well as peer-reviewed journals such as Science, Paragraph, and Feminist Theory. With the Out of the Woods Writing Collective, Lewis co-authored the collection Hope Against Hope, Writings on Ecological Crisis, published by Common Notions in 2020. As an editor at Blind Field Journal, she helps foster communities of Marxist feminist cultural criticism. A visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Research on Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies, Sophie is nevertheless a freelance writer sustained by her Patreon, which you are highly encouraged to donate to on a regular basis. Her lectures, podcast appearances, and essays are archived at LASOPHIELLE.org. I'll put that in the chat. She tweets at Repro Utopia. So please, Sophie Lewis.
Wow, thank you. I didn't realize that would be so long. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And hi, everyone, from Lenny Lenape land, known as Philadelphia. And thanks for spending some of your Sunday with me to think about the abolition of the family and the idea of children. Thanks especially to Hannah Zebin and to my longtime friend and comrade Emmy and to Alex Colston and Wendy Lotterman for inviting me and then arranging with Verso for these advanced e-copies to be available, and not least for commissioning me to write an essay of auto-analysis for the first issue of the hotly anticipated Parapraxis magazine, whose first issue will be about the family. The experience of writing that was generative and terrifying in all the best ways. Likewise, I've just found it extraordinarily rewarding to participate in this first, hopefully the first of many series of the Psychosocial Foundation's seminars, so auspiciously kicked off on Mother's Day. Helping facilitate to the best of my ability when possible. As you know, today I'm going to talk a little bit about Dr. Madeleine Lane McKinley's essay, The Idea of Children. Hello, Madeleine, and its influence on my thinking and teaching. And then I'm going to try to summarize my quote unquote manifesto for care and liberation, which you read, hopefully in such a way that the links to the previous readings, presentations, and themes in this seminar series feel apparent. Unsurprisingly, given our years of thinking together, I've been incredibly well set up by ME for this session with Dr. Gossett's presentation last week on the abolition of Moynihan's quote unquote Negro family, covering very much that I would want to say here, and in some ways more. Much of what I tried to say in chapter 2, which is called Abolish Which Family. And ME's own essay on the history and historically evolving meanings of the call to abolish the family in the context of 20th century class struggle, occupying us next week, alongside Kathy Weeks's invaluable, even more recent paper on the abolition of the family as feminism's most infamous proposal, this time with Madeleine leading us. So in that context, when we talked about what might be most generative to focus on for this session, again, given next week's menu and the fact that part 2 on the revolutionary horizon has already guided us through Engels, Kollontai, Dalla Costa and James, Davis, Spillers, and King, Tiffany Letabo King, we thought that it might be most useful to make space for revolutionary, perhaps almost consciousness raising inspired reflection on the sort of psychical and psychological dimensions of the abolition of the family, especially our quite possibly universal resistance to this infamous proposal. So yeah, in Abolish the Family, as you know, if you had time to read it, before I dig in to a potted history of the family, the history of family abolitionism, which I see as a kind of, or I try to tell as a sort of dual strand history, the two strands being, as it were, inside and outside the house of legitimate familiality. I begin, right, with a chapter that's playfully entitled, you know, "But I love my family," in order to try to engage, acknowledge, and assuage, even if only partially, that psychic terror that the proposition "abolish the family" elicits. And I think Lane McKinley's essay is doing much of that same work. It was published in 2018 in a moment that was defined by a spike in immigration and customs enforcement kinship violence, you know, which is a primary technology of this settler colony. And so happily, given the timing, I was able to cite it almost last minute in Full Surrogacy Now, which, you know, was my previous offering, which I believe, you know, neither I nor my publisher really expected anyone to read. And luckily it sort of worked out that, you know, there is some appetite for clarification of the almost, yeah, the almost not quite buried, but sort of, you know, not centered, you know, family abolitionist program in that gestator's manifesto, you know, which, you know, like most of what I do, tries to grapple with the problem of what anti-work horizons in the context of care work look like, or, you know, how does anti-work in the context of care work work? Like how does that tension, you know, guide our politics, especially given that Full Surrogacy Now has, as you can probably hear from the title, a sort of, you know, a call for labor as well, you know, like it's a call for a sort of turning inside out of proprietarian, authorial parenting, you know, such that the very word surrogacy would be impossible because children do not belong to anyone. But that's not what I'm here to talk about, so I'm sorry for the digression. I was, you know, the idea of children was by no means the only trace of Lane McKinley in that book, since I've been learning from and thinking with Madeline since about 2016 around themes like, you know, wages against housework, critical utopianism, which is a sort of lens and method that I've learned, yeah, a lot from Madeline concerning. What else? Trans-feminist, anti-racist approaches to that very problematic fave, Shulamith Firestone, whose call to abolish childhood, I believe we both agree, surely got backwards, which is why in the idea of children, we have the abolition of adulthood, right? The dissolution of the border between adulthood and childhood, which is a horizon that goes far beyond inclusivity, right? The inclusion of children in society. And I will say that that's just something that becomes more and more relevant. Recent social media discourse was surprisingly disappointing, really, in terms of the left's willingness to think about those we currently call children as persons to obviously struggle with as comrades, rather than segregate apart from proper political life. Anyway, as you can tell, I'm very digressional. So just give me signs to stay back on topic. So yeah, so the idea of children is something I've been returning to ever since I read it in 2018. There's also really clamor for it. People ask for it to be included in my Brooklyn Institute for Social Research courses, which is very smart of them, because it only becomes more relevant. It's certainly something I was thinking of at the end of this 2022 text you read for today, where alongside Madeline and also the critical utopianist from the UK, Lola Olufemi, who's the author of Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, which I really recommend you read. We try to suggest that while keeping families together and ending family separation are political imperatives, right, and calls to action for all white race traitors, still they are not our horizon. And we try. I'm trying to grapple in that final sort of goodbye to the manifesto, and how fighting the family regime might thus, have to look like several different things at once, right? Prizing the state's neck off the boot off the neck of a legal family of aliens, right? And really advancing that horizon of no human is illegal and so on. And at the same time, offering solidarity to a queer kid in that same, family, should she need it, against her parents, right? And those things are in tension, which is why I'm really hoping that we have more opportunity in the future to really get into how abolition of family policing, right, and family abolition can be in sort of dialectic conversation and collaboration with one another. That's the whole thing, really. And Madeline's question, how would you talk to a child about family abolition, as I say, has been the guiding light in more than one of my my little courses that I teach at BISSER. I think there are participants in those courses in the room today. And what really came out of the idea of children essay in my teaching, in my classrooms, as it were, was this like a deep sort of attention to what Madeline calls the ongoing friction with conditions of unimaginability, right? That's kind of what I'm trying to open up today in terms of the terror we feel about that unimaginability. I think Kathy Weeks almost goes sort of further and asserts that as subjects materially and psychically constituted by the Oedipal kinship story, we are, not even fully capable of desiring the abolition of the family today. And so that's what Kathy Weeks also in a talk phrased as the future is not for us. Very, very alarming and sort of upsetting proposition if you hear it in a certain way. Not necessarily, right? If you're willing to, to engage with it, in a in a way that's sort of happy to kind of almost dwell in the the abolition of the self. But another Blindfield journal editor, Johanna Isaacson, has actually written about this, in a little essay at Blindfield about Abolish the Family, which begins from this central critical utopianist premise, which is that the future perhaps is not for us, but there's this very long task of sort of gestating it nevertheless. So this kind of not quite desirable, not quite imaginable horizon of the category of child and adult no longer obtaining in the way that it does today, nevertheless remains something it might be worthwhile to struggle towards. So yeah, that was one of the themes in a class on quote unquote children's liberation, right, which very much like Abolish the Family is a sort of horizon and demand, if you like, that has been very actively buried, actively sort of forgotten and erased during the 80s, such that today, it hits people's ears as words that have never been uttered before, right? As concepts that have never been, articulated before. Whereas that's not the case at all, right? There was, 50 years ago, some degree of familiarity, on the far left in revolutionary milieus with these sorts of precepts. So a lot of my work has, and Madeleine's has got to do with this kind of, critical, comradely sort of unburying, right, and remembering. So that's some of what that side of things sort of speaks to me today. My Abolish the Family text, as I mentioned this thing, the dual strand history. So that, that's kind of the structure of this history for me, and we can get more into the nitty gritty tomorrow with the end notes. It almost a short book in itself, really. I think it's basically the same length as my book, to Abolish the Family. But my much sort of, I suppose I'm taking more liberties here, trying to tell a story where indigenous and enslaved and transported individuals in the US, can perhaps be understood as operating, so some revolutionary horizons within those populations can be understood as family abolitionist, even if that vocabulary has not been much in circulation, because of these critiques that Dr. Gossett drew out so well last week, which posits, again, the sort of impossibility of an entity like the Black family, and posits a kind of excess to the horizon of sort of Black becoming that would never be sort of containable or even admissible, really, to the proprietarian logic of the private nuclear household. So part of my work in chapter 2 was to go back into archives of 60s queer liberationism, gay liberationism, so-called third worldist and third world liberationist convergences, where I was sort of surprised to find traces of very affirmative family abolitionism, family destructionism, coming from Black organizers, that I wasn't aware until I really went and looked that there are politics like this in anthologies like This Bridge Called My Back, right? And so I'm in conversation with with people. I suppose I mentioned them at the end of the book, and also in chapter 2, like Annie Olaluku Tariba, who's also based in the UK, Lola Olufemi, but then also these 70s figures such as Kay Lindsay and Pat Parker. And this comes from a perspective that seeks to, you know, not just liberate children from their status as, you know, the poorest people in the world. You know, that's just one thing that you know, that is sort of central. Like, you know, children are poor, but also from their status as kind of you know, patriarchal possessions, really. And so, you know, the line of critique that has, I think, to some extent disappeared, not just from feminism, but from leftism in general, but which is sort of really being revived by the people I just mentioned from an anti-racist perspective. Is this idea that you know, motherhood needs to be distinguished from the potentially transformative, potentially comradely, and certainly gender open, gender inclusive, or, you know, perhaps ungendered labor of mothering. Funnily enough, that, you know, that's also something that you know, Adrienne Rich said, you know, fundamentally, right, in Of Woman Born, we get the dialectic tension between motherhood, which is an institution of property, and mothering, which is a potentially liberatory, cooperative and collaborative praxis. And yeah, you know, I'm a bit of a magpie. I sort of take these ideas and try and bring them together. You know, for me, the horizon of mothering against motherhood can generatively be thought together with, you know, xenofeminist concepts like, you know, xeno-hospitality, where, you know, perhaps relations that are given to us, you know, biologically, legitimately, you know, legally, can be defamiliarized by thinking about the difference between proprietarian relations like motherhood and dynamic relational processual ones like mothering. So perhaps, you know, beyond simply the fact that, as Helen Hester puts it, you know, xenofam, you know, so xenofam being relations that are, you know, made explicitly, alienly, adoptively, is, you know, equal to or greater than biofam being the relations that, you know, are imagined as immutable, biological given. We could also imagine, and I think this is important, that the people we think we have, right, the people we think we have and know might in fact be xeno as well, be xenofam as well. And so that's where, you know, the imperative to, you know, to really respect, for example, people who literally come out of our bodies comes from, right? Annie Olaluku Tariba got a hell of a lot of, you know, hostility really on social media not so long ago for suggesting that, you know, motherhood is patriarchal, and that a lot of, including Black mothers, are, you know, patriarchal in their treatment of children. But this, as I say, was, you know, was a conversation that was active and live in the long 60s. And part of the conversation we need to have is about the mechanisms, the reasons, the material conditions for that active burial and forgetting, right? Yeah, I don't know, this has all been very sort of unstructured. I can see Michelle, Michelle thinking, my God, what was the plan for this? So I think I've gone for almost 25 minutes. Is that correct? Perhaps we could open it up to conversation here. Does that sound acceptable?
Yeah, let's do direct questions to you for 15 minutes or so, and then take a 5-minute break and then open it up for a wider discussion. I have a direct question. So you started talking about the sort of the psychic space of family abolition as a demand, as a concept, and particularly the resistance that that provokes for people. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the desire around it, the sort of psychic space it opens up that you have encountered in your own teaching, in your own thinking, in your speaking, like when people start connecting the family abolition as a concept, what happens in their minds and hearts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think so. For several years, I've been really moved and excited and perhaps surprised by the amount of enthusiasm that has come from people going through childbirth, for example, for the concepts in full surrogacy now, for a sort of deprivatized or unproprietarian, anti-proprietarian relation between carers, motherers, and children. I think what happens with people is frequently described to me as a sort of initial spasm of fear, like when you hear something like full surrogacy now or abolish the family, you think, oh no, like everything is so bad and unbearable under capitalism and climate catastrophe and rising fascism. The sphere of the family is the only good thing I've got going on for some people, right? And it could also have a lot of bad stuff going on in it at the same time, but in some ways it's experienced as, if not entirely, a haven away from work, because I think it's very well understood these days, even if not sufficiently, that the home is a workplace, is a terrain that works, that has work. But people still feel that there's a little bit more comfort there, decommodified social relations, so it's really terrifying to hear someone say, no, you shouldn't have that or something, like, we're taking that away, we're taking grandma away, we're taking your children away, like, and it's sort of the opposite in a way when people begin to understand, okay, no, I think I try to put it in one place as the family being a sort of technology or mode of doing existence that is taken up very rationally and very reasonably by people as a kind of shield to survive a war, that deserves full respect and even support. But if we think that the shield, is nature, if we begin to forget that it was a shield, we're forgetting that the war perhaps doesn't have to go on forever. And so I think when people begin to understand, yeah, it's about proliferation and abundance, and about giving the people we love more abundance, more care, more freedom, more autonomy, then I think it becomes sort of the opposite of scary. It's as though the wisdom and skill that we develop in these cracks between commodified social relations could be given full breath for the first time, and that sort of that blackmail that forces them into these choked little pockets, being removed might be a really exciting, really comradely sort of way of being. Yeah, I think I've had people explain to me that they're so relieved that some of these conversations about nature and denaturalization and polymaternalism are happening because they are, for example, step parents, right, whose relationship with kids is frequently sort of socially treated as less than, you know, because relations between, you know, adults and children are supposed to be authorial, really, you know. And if you don't, if you're a step mom, you know, don't you want a child of your own, right, is a frequent sort of social question that arises. And so there's a lot of kind of relief and I don't know, validation that can come from having a conversation happen where, you know, not only are children active participants in relationships who perhaps, you know, in Firestone's horizon, for example, might deserve, for example, a say about where they live, with whom and how, but also, you know, the sort of the grown-up part of that relation, you know, deserves, you know, acknowledgement outside of the sort of legitimized roles and titles of parenthood. It is certainly the case, isn't it, that like relationships between grown-ups and children are, you know, are almost prescribed, well, you know, right now, outside of the legitimizing, containers, boxes of full parenthood, you know. Yeah, I don't know. My partner was watching for our sins an episode of Real Housewives yesterday, and there was a house. You can read Rosa Della Costa and then watch the Real Housewives of, you know, Beverly Hills, and it's a hell of a mental conundrum. But she was saying one you know, ruling class housewife that explicitly that her daughter should have contact with no other adult, that she had not, like, and this was an 18-year-old daughter, right? But there is a sanctioned ruling class view that a parent has, in some sense, you know, a right to define exactly who a child, an 18-year-old child, will be impressed by, right, be shaped by, and this, you know, this is horrifying. You know, this is a fascistic view, right? Yeah, so we have a long way to go, right? Critical childhood studies is the field I honestly think, you know, leftists, revolutionaries in general should be engaging, you know, full tilt right now, because of the mounting sort of mobilization, you know, of sort of explicitly proprietarian, sort of fascistic concepts of childhood right now. The assault on trans children, you know, the assault on gestational autonomy, you know, and the you know, the pedophile industrial complex, right? The organized association of, you know, queer life with abuse, child sexual abuse specifically, and grooming, and so on. And it's in critical childhood studies that we find the knowledge, the wisdom, the histories that help us bring together different kinds of abolitionism, prison abolitionism, abolishing the police, and the abolition of if you like, adulthood or childhood, or the because and that's really, it's in fact the weaponization of childhood as a concept, which is racial, right, which cannot be deracialized, according to people like Erica Miners, for example. You know, that we'll find our way out of this, you know, this grooming discourse impasse. You know, we have to go that deep. I don't think we're going to fix it unless we, you know, joyfully acknowledge our shared humanity with people of, you know, different generations. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, we've got Wendy and then someone called Henry.
Thanks so much, Sophie. I really enjoyed reading your book, and also this presentation. And even though you don't talk so explicitly about psychoanalysis in the book, there were a couple moments that stood out to me as being especially available for bringing these two discourses together, which is basically, you know, what this seminar is about. And one of them is that I've seen in psychoanalytic writing an attempt to kind of account for a sort of like pre-Oedipal guilt experienced by children in relation to their caregiving parents in terms of kind of feeling responsible for depleting resources or putting some sort of strain on the parent, like which might be called like guilt about being born or something like that. But it doesn't really offer like an etiology of why that guilt might exist, and sort of just places it on like the parent sort of being like doing something wrong by making the child feel responsible for this exhaustion of resources. And I thought there was something really compelling in your book on page 18 when you say, "I'd wager that you two can imagine something better than the lottery that drops a neonate arbitrarily among 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 individuals of a particular class and keeps her there for the best part of 2 decades without her consent, making her wholly beholden to them for her physical survival, legal existence, and economic identity." And then this is the part that really stood out to me, "and forcing her to be the reason they give away their lives and work." And it occurred to me that this like having to be, as a child, the reason that your parents give away their lives and work is like a really useful way to think about what might produce in a child a certain kind of sense of guilt or responsibility that could then lead toward a certain kind of masochism that has really no kind of explanation for the conditions that produced that dynamic, for which psychoanalysis then might be one kind of solution in presenting the opportunity for a new kind of relationship to the analyst that relieves you of that sense of responsibility or guilt and recreates a more healthy dynamic. But I feel that like you've really, I don't know, like given me something in how I can, I don't know, it really adds something. And I don't know, I guess my question would be like, what, like, how do you hope, and maybe you don't have an answer for this, and maybe this question doesn't even need to be asked, but like, how do you hope psychoanalysis might like take up some of the work that you do in this book and make it kind of integral to some of its theorizations and even therapeutic solutions or something?
Let's hear from Henrik's question as well, and then close with you, Sophie, before the break.
Thank you. Well, my question was sort of trying to riff on yours, Amy O'Brien, in that I was wondering if, when we're framing the question as a matter of abolition of a family, whether or not we're ceding ground to capitalism, so to speak, letting it dictate its terms on what gets to count as family and what gets to count as family relations. So as, and sort of ceding that ground to capitalism by saying that, well, it's that well is totally poisoned now. And also on that note, whether this makes it harder to actually see the currently existing ways of undermining or riffing on or expanding upon the family dynamics that exist currently. Because if you position it as something impossible and revolutionary and unthinkable, then it becomes much more difficult to see in what way people are engaging with it right now.
Okay, those are 2 huge questions. I think the second one first. No, we're not ceding ground to capitalism, in my opinion. Next week we'll be reading Kathy Weeks's, very Weeks, in typical Weeksian fashion, it's extremely systematic, much less rhizomatic in its kind of thought processes than mine, but I think she's extremely valuable, and I use it really in my book, adopt it really. She says, what is the family? She sort of has 3 definitions. I'll skip the first two, which she says explicitly are less important for her. The main thing is privatization of care. Okay, sorry, the other two are something to do with the couple form and a biogenetic centered concept of kinship. But the main thing is privatization of care. It is not, capitalism is eroding the family in its sort of colloquial sense, right? It atomizes, it attempts to commodify all of life, sure. But the family is its technology. The family is a technology of capitalism because it is, above all, the privatization of care. That is also why we do not reserve a specific form of familiality, queer, indigenous, Black, whatever, to protect, from abolition. That doesn't make any sense. That's completely backwards. It is precisely those populations, racialized, marginalized, excluded, othered from the wages of family that are best served by abolition of the family. It would be completely backwards to pretend that that those things that are, and Spillers suggests, perhaps oxymoronically sort of called, the Black family, should somehow be valorized and used as a model for society at large, right? That's exactly backwards. I don't know if that's like a full response to that, but yeah. This is why I insist not just on saying abolish the family, but also on a sort of linguistic, beyond to the language and imaginary of kinship, right? It's like chapter 4. Oh my God, didn't I already sort of argue against enough like natural shibboleths? I think kinship is wrong too. I mean, not wrong, but insufficient for this reason, right? Because we can get as far together as thinking, all right, yeah, let's make kin with all the world, and I don't think that works. I think we need a bit more rupture in order to truly get to the heart of this privatization of care and the fantasy of a sort of metaphysically non-contingent basis for our relations, right? What we want more than anything in this kind of, constant revolution of that capitalist history is, right, is some kind of notion that, like, you don't have any choice but to care for me, right? That's when that, you literally cannot leave me because nature has ordained you as my carer, right? That's what we want out of our motherers. And so bioconservatives, who I've done a lot of kind of studying in my research on commercial gestational surrogacy and the sort of dystopian characters of that industry and so on, and the feminisms that oppose it on proprietarian grounds. The worst idea in the world for some feminists is the idea that children might learn. Oh my God, don't tell them, that there is some kind of contingency, some kind of choice, some kind of labor and freedom involved in their care. Children must not learn that. What if they learned that babies are sometimes made, for money, or mom literally made a baby for money? No, that would be the most traumatic thing in the world. Well, obviously we're all made in a way that is contaminated by, by capitalist social relations. It sucks. That's why we need to de-romanticize the concepts with which we think our manufacture. Mothering is not romantic. It's not. It's also quite damaging for the giver, and that's why anti-work needs to be thought as a maximal distribution of that labor. So it doesn't kind of injure so much that the party for whom it is prescribed, to give, and then you don't get those dynamics of sort of blackmail that Wendy was talking about, like, I carried you for 9 months under my heart. I worked 18 years. I destroyed myself in wage labor for you. Like, it's true, isn't it? Like that is the violence of the family. that kind of you know, horrifying relation is sort of placed between people when there's no need, there's no reason for that other than the production of surplus value. And in the past, people, you know, wanted to think about well, so and in the present, of course, you know, kitchenless cities, right? Cities where, you know, children and women, according to some of these utopian urban planning feminists, would be liberated in a significant way because of the sort of removal from our psychical and architectural landscapes of the private kitchen. You know, if you anticipate that your, you know, the body and soul will be kept together, obviously, you know, it goes without saying that you will receive food in the public, in the common sphere, right? Then a large component of the sort of technology of you know, of individualization via patriarchal motherhood is removed, and we have more freedom to meet one another as potentially comrades, right? Including kind of like mothers and children, you know. I don't know if that makes sense. Wendy, it's really hard for me to think clearly about how psychoanalysis should adopt all this. I suppose some really obvious things that you already kind of gestured towards might be like around, I don't know, sort of simply making space for the pain of you know, of hating work around care, to be held, you know. It's really shameful to hate your job when your job is to care. That should shift, you know. We shouldn't be ashamed. It's not our fault. Yeah, too much is being asked of too few.
Let's do a 5-minute break, and when we get back, I think Wendy's question of what to make of this psychoanalytically is a good question for all of us to consider, and that we can perhaps open that up as a collective discussion a bit, as well as making room for Catherine's critique here in the chat and other things that come up. So let's take a 5-minute break and then come back together.
So Emmy's connection was dropped, so I'm just gonna moderate conversation until she's able to return. If you have any questions, definitely raise your hands. Otherwise, we can go into the chat. I don't know if Catherine and Sophie wanted to pick up this conversation you were having, but also anyone else who has questions, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah.
Hi. Something in your book, Sophie, really caught my eye. It's a moment where you talk about the abolition of slavery and the connection you make between abolition and like Aufhebung, and like you say this really interesting stuff about like how this is a moment where humanism is abolished, but also maybe sort of fulfilled. Its true promise is, made clear for the first time when we can acknowledge that like the previous definitions of humanism are absurd in their limitations. And what struck me about this was that there seemed to be a little slip from the abolition of slavery to the abolition of humanism. And what I wanted to think about was the way that I think if we just think about the abolition of slavery in the same terms, and we think about the abolition of slavery as a moment where maybe superficially slavery is gone, but in fact, we're just beginning to explore the true potentials of slavery and all these different ways that we can extend the institution of slavery, continue to establish new kinds of caste systems and new kinds of laws, and this kind of like backlash. I don't want to do like a whole summarizing of New Jim Crow, but I guess given this kind of reading of slavery abolition is like not really the end of slavery, I wonder how we might think through the potential for family to kind of sneak back in through the back door after its abolition in the context of a kind of insurrectionary communal kitchen type situation. Like how can we think about the potential for the form of the family to continually reemerge, even in better contexts that we might hope to create? And I don't have much to say about this necessarily, but it occurs to me that maybe psychoanalysis can help us think through how this particular type of relation might continually emerge, even in the best of circumstances. So that's something I was thinking about.
Yeah.
So, do you want us to take more questions, or do you want to? Yeah,
I was especially because that just like seemed like the question, and I think it's a great comment in a way.
Okay, great. So let's take other Alex's question, and then
Okay. I also wanted to get to Catherine's comment at some point as well, or the exchanges that you were having in the chat. But I'm just trying to think about. I think it's a huge question that has been posed, and it is the question of the seminars, and I've been thinking about it a lot. And I think what's interesting about the psychoanalytic situation with patients is that, so if just for a second, if it can be possibly bracketed, just forget the material antagonism of the family for a second. Psychically, it's really hard to get patients and people, you might have experienced this yourself if you're in analysis, to talk about the psychical antagonisms in your childhood. Infantile complexes, neuroses, difficulties, they're all kind of screened off from you. It takes a lot of it takes time and patience and talking about it a lot to even return to the kind of, nuclear complex at the heart of your early years. In a way that there's a defensive fantasy against recognizing, right, the constitutive antagonisms that make up who you are. And then in a kind of a parallel way, the material critique of the private economic household and the family unit also gets kind of screened off. Like Henrik's question is an interesting one because it's like, there's a kind of belief, I think, that there's a utopian element of being a child. You're not explicitly like waging for labor. You're an unwaged worker, and that's an exploitation. But in a way, you're relieved of those duties. In a way, you have a dependency on adults, but that relieves you of the responsibility of being an adult. So there's this kind of contradiction or this antagonism of like a wish to be a child unencumbered by material antagonisms and unencumbered by the psychical affliction of hating your family or hating your parents or whatever. So I think in a way there's like that, the critique of the family form and then the psychoanalytic process of uncovering the kind of unconscious antagonisms of your life in your interpersonal dynamics and the transference work in conjunction with one another. But that's entirely speculative, so I don't know exactly how it works. But the more and more I'm thinking about this question about how what psychoanalysis can learn from family abolition, both clinically and I think in terms of social critique, I'm led more and more again to the question of like, okay, well, how did the constitutive fantasies of the family form and of being a child and of being a parent resist the critique itself of the economic private household? You know, and because there's a sense that you give up something in that. There's a kind of subjective destitution to lose the family, because indeed that's the crucible of who you are. And so I think, and then Alex's question about the kind of unconscious, the persistence of unconscious formations, even after they've been abolished, whatever we might mean by that, right? I mean, because there's a sense, I think, that I think sometimes we slip into this belief that there's just an event. And then after the event, things are communized and we're in a different set of material relations. And that might very well be true. And I'm not going to hold out against that possibility. But nevertheless, if Freud is correct, and it's a huge if, that unconscious formations, historical unconscious formations persist in the psyche, regardless of the historical present, there's a kind of conundrum there that I think Alex might be speaking to, which is that, you know, those antagonisms, those forms of transference relationships of the capitalist family might persist in some kind of, you know, hobbled form of sorts. Sorry, that was my computer. But anyways, that's a lot of comments. And I just wanted to just get things on the table, I suppose, more than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are both fantastic comments, or series of comments. What is best for me to do right now, Wendy? Should we also acknowledge the conversation in the chat going on, or I mean, we could also hear more comments. I think that would be really great.
Yeah, maybe we'll take we'll take Patrick's and Molly's comments, and then we can also just kind of fold the conversation in the comments into your response if you feel like that's not too much to put on you at once. Does that work? Okay. Patrick, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm also delivering this question on behalf of Abby, who is in another state but has audio interference there. So she's I'm trying to like vocalize this, but I may be doing it violence. I was thinking, though, that this piggybacks nicely on sort of Alex's question, right? I'm just thinking about, and I don't really know where to go with this, but I just wanted to put something on the table, like the psychoanalytic vocabulary of like attachment, right? And its sort of history via Bowlby, but also a lot of feminist psychoanalysts, right, who were, you know, so in many cases like become psychoanalysts because they're in non-Western contexts and they have to do childcare and they observe how people around them are doing childcare, et cetera. And it's sort of, you know, without necessarily being biological, does kind of give a term, not quantized, but like it reifies this idea of, well, what's the bond between caregivers in a way that's not necessarily edible, right? What's this containing environment that a child needs? And I was just thinking about like attachment as a concept against the as like a psychoanalytic rejoinder or a revised psychoanalytic way of thinking about ties within not like the nuclear family per se, but in terms of just like the rearing environment more broadly, and whether that's one sort of vector forward on this. That's just what I wanted to put out there, and hopefully, Abby, that paraphrases what you wanted me to ask.
Yeah, go ahead, Molly, and then we'll go back to Sophie.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much. This is giving me lots and lots to think about. What's sort of striking me as well, though, I guess it's a little bit like what Henrik was saying, is that in this sort of discourse of abolishing the family, your focus seems to be a lot on the caregiving as work and the privatization of care. I think from a psychoanalytic point of view, the emphasis falls more on the child's helplessness, almost as a hostage in a setup situation. So I'm just wondering what you would say to that the child in a way can be the proletariat in this setup. And there's, we also have the complexity of step parenting, fathers who are full-time parenting, all these sorts of elements, the complexity of sibling relationships, which can become sites of oppression or sites of suffering. All these things seem to me to demand a more, just a sense of the battlefield. It's a little bit like what Tolstoy says, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own singular way. So I just wonder what you thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so Sophie, take it away.
It's really interesting that Tolstoy quote is one that I use to jump off in an essay about horror cinema and family, but actually
it's so important, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if you're familiar in fact, Ursula K. Le Guin argues that it's exactly wrong, that it is the production of happiness that is the more complex and sort of fleeting sort of material phenomenon, that in fact every unhappy family is unhappy in exactly the same way for the same reasons, and that every happy family is fleetingly but extremely interestingly happy for reasons that we should almost like anthropologically and historically.
Maybe they're both. I think they're both real. I don't think it's a fiction that there's a singularity to family unhappiness.
I see that point too. I think her essay is really worth looking at in terms of how she proposes, perhaps with relevance to psychoanalytic inquiry, that in general, happiness has stood as a less interesting subject than as a lesser, almost feminized subject for analysis than unhappiness. So yeah, no, you're right. I'm just gonna, I don't know if I'll be able to work backwards and remember everything, but Molly, the question of the sort of work component of care, yeah, and you were saying the focus on the helplessness of the child would be more of an important thing to center if we were doing this psychoanalytically. I think both is important. It's very upsetting, I think, when we encounter the social factory thesis of the long 60s, of the wages against housework kind of perspective, to fully internalize this really difficult fact that mothering is work, and work is violence. I think the problem that comes up in these conversations is the idea that someone is saying it's just and only work, right? I don't read that in this analysis. I think it's important to try and not hear that, and that precisely the problem is the degree to which the activities that are, in a sense, the most important ones on earth, I think I feel sort of happy saying that in a way, are being stolen and turned into work, not totalizing, but just to bring up the old Silvia Federici quote, nothing so effectively stifles our lives as the transformation into work of those activities that satisfy our desires, right? We should be angry at the extent to which those things that we would like to be doing, spending time with children, being, perhaps held and cared for in turn by children, right? Being made, the process of sort of making and being made, is stolen and turned into work, and that's that I think being willing to think about that complexity, that duality, you know, I think makes it easier to tolerate this very unpleasant sort of charge that, you know, stuff that, you know, in a sense we, you know, a lot of people do happily as being called work and as being, you know, subject to abolitionist, you know, assaults. You know? Yeah, God, my memory. So
There's Pat's question about attachment, and then also maybe up to you if you want to pick up the conversation in the chat as well about.
Could I get the one sentence reformulation of the attachment question? I'm very sorry. Is that possible? Restate the question.
I was just wondering, or Abby, I was wondering on behalf of Abby whether like attachment offers a certain vocabulary for thinking about like the insistence of ties and it not necessarily reducible to biology, but that might be a vector for thinking about the plasticity of family. Thanks.
Sorry. Yes. Right. Of course. Of course. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure, you know, I'm sure. And maybe that's, yeah, maybe then we need to also think about the degree, like what it is that makes some kind of concept of my people, having people, you know, a problem. What are the conditions that render that potentially nationalistic? And you're right. And I think that's, yeah, I don't know entirely the answer, but I liked the analysis of the authors of the CARE manifesto that insisted on that link between family attachment and nationalism, right? This was a core point of the 60s family abolitionists too, that you need that the nation is the family is a microcosm of the nation, and that our structures of thought are trained into this competitive model, this sort of, which also, you know, is yeah, determined by, you know, by the need to survive. You know, we provide for ours, and we keep out, you know, others, and, you know, and we compete against neighbors, and, you know, yeah, I was also, for my sins, I listened to Nina Power's Opinions on Compact podcast recently, and she was specifically talking about how the problem with gender relations right now is the fact that men and women are turning into siblings with competitive relations vis-a-vis one another, when I suppose in a golden past they were, you know, heterosexually differentiated and allocated to different spheres, allowing a, you know, a harmonious you know, production of and reproduction of the whole. I don't know. I totally disagree that there's something kind of inherent about the, like, sibling. We'll be talking about that later in the seminar, won't we, with Hannah, which I'm really looking forward to. But this naturalization of the idea that, you know, that, for example, different children in a household might be in competition with another necessarily, seems to me, yeah, to be lacking that material analysis that, Wendy, you were talking about, is missing when we talk about, yeah, you know, the blame and resentment we feel towards one another, you know, when we've been sort of compelled to be disproportionately responsible, you know, for the labor of anthrogenesis, as I call it. Yeah, what else is there to say now? So Alex, and then other Alex. I thought those were fantastic comments. I mean, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the chat with I don't know if you feel comfortable, Catherine, unmuting, but I think I'd love that to be brought into the you know, the YouTube archive, as it were, because it seems really central. But basically, if you're not comfortable unmuting, I suppose I can say that we're talking about the ins and outs of describing, as I understand it, sort of colonized forms of kinship, and pre-colonial forms of kinship as families, and what I suppose I could read out, if you prefer, or Emmy, what do you think?
I mean, let me use the reference that we've been talking about as a group in other conversations. I'm thinking about Fred Moten's consent to be more than a singular being. And obviously, he's not talking for all sort of non-Western forms of family, but I feel like that's a really good starting point. There is a mode of being, and I mean, he's also very focused on, in some ways, on biology or on the material, the fact that we are in many ways human animals. But there's a way of inhabiting the body that is not singular, that does not emphasize either an identity or even for that matter, a subject, that doesn't sort itself into personhood. And that mode of being in one's own body enables one to be with the bodies of others, including the bodies that both issue from yourself and sort of enter your sphere of self, that I think really sidesteps the notion of me and my and private property, but at the same time, like provides stable and consistent basis of care. And I think other cultures have in very, very different ways worked out modes of creating those social relations. And I think it's worth learning from those social relations. So that's my first point. That, I mean, as a kind of anthropological point, that there are other cultures that have worked out alternative forms to the private nuclear family that does not simply abolish the family. That's what family looks like in their culture, or at least it can look like. And it's worth learning from those. And the second point, and I say this as someone who grew up in communist China, family abolition has been done before in communist China and in other places. And in many places, the results are not just horrific. I mean, members of my family were set on fire by our neighbors. To put it very mildly, the generational trauma continues. I'm several generations out from it, and it's to me incredibly obvious. But these are cultures that did not begin with a Western notion of individual self. The very sense of what it means to be a person in that culture, to use that term very loosely, is already sort of communal. And this is before the communist revolution, which in some ways worked and in other ways didn't. But I mean, my point is that like there are other structures of belonging that does not simply rarefy the me and mine, that does not sort of fit into a framework of what for me is like a colonized notion of the self and of the family in its turn. And attempts to abolish families have historically, I mean, frankly, just fragmented and severed and done terrible violence to those alternative notions of family. And in turn, what sort of grows in its stead is a kind of clinging onto the nuclear private family instead. So I worry that family abolition, especially when it doesn't A, look at other frameworks, and B, really, really grapple with its history, including the violence and like experiments gone terribly wrong, that it often kind of brackets and say, that's not what we're doing. But yeah, but like, I don't think they intended to do that either. How did they end up doing that? Like, how do you actually learn from that history rather than disavow it? So that's what I'm really, really calling for.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for giving voice to that. I think maybe Emmy wants to respond, so we'll go there.
Yeah, I certainly want to honor your critiques and your questions, Catherine, and raising the history of the Cultural Revolution in China. And there's so much to talk about here. And I think it's important that your trauma and your family's trauma be taken seriously here. I want to speak to another dimension of your comments. You referenced the Indian boarding schools of Canada and the United States. And I've been reading a lot about them for my own writing about family abolition. And the boarding schools were set up by mostly the Catholic Church and later with a lot of state support out of a really deliberate program of trying to figure out how to impose family relations onto Indigenous people. That there was a lot of concern with the settler nations that Indigenous people in North America didn't organize property relations based on the patriarchal family, based on the private family. And the level of cooperative cross-familial property relations made it very difficult to figure out how to interface in capitalist property relations. And this is one of a number of elements of the settler state that really geared towards the genocide of indigenous people. And that genocide both was focused on exterminating indigenous people, but also figuring out how to force indigenous people to adopt white cultural practices and white property practices. And that the boarding schools did both. They were putting children into these environments where they died in extremely high numbers, they were brutally beaten, they were tortured for practicing indigenous spirituality, they were tortured for not speaking English, so a real kind of exterminationist element, but they were also adopted out to white families. And late in the boarding school process, allotment became a major part of the gears of genocide. And allotment was redistributing reservation land to patriarchal nuclear, or not nuclear, but patriarchal family units of indigenous people. And so dividing up the reservation land into family plots. And that was really explicitly designed both to ultimately take away a lot of property and to transition indigenous people into family-based capitalist property relations. And so that sort of the family in this context is the imposition of the settler white family was concurrent and part of the same project as the development of the Indian boarding schools as an instrument of genocide. And that I think in talking about family abolition, we're trying to imagine overcoming both sides of that dialectic. On the one hand, the family as a white institution of private property, and on the other hand, the genocidal violent decimation of other kinds of kinship relations. And that, in the history of settler colonialism, calling this family was really integral to the Christian white supremacist capitalist ideological project at play. So I think I don't know to what extent that's helpful, but I think that, sort of looking at these histories of assaults on kinship, they were often done in the name of the family, in the project of the family, and part of the strategy of imposing the private family.
But I wonder if we repeat that violence when we say family abolition, a word that, and we sort of make it as a universal claim, and rather than really ask what other forms of family have been done before, to what extent have those worked? And it's really not just family, it's also what notions of a self, what notions of a term that I think escapes the conversation, what modes of embodiment, what ways of inhabiting the body and the milieu around the body. I think it's actually worth learning from that. And sort of maybe, for me, it would, the way forward would be to sort of, there's no doubt to me, like the nuclear, private, Western, and to be blunt, white notion of family is a disaster, But rather than trying to sort of abolish that and start over, which that's been done before, why not see what other models of being are out there? And how are there ways that we can actually learn from that? And can we start that learning not from an idea or an abstraction or theory, but from what habits of embodiment do they ask us to make in ourselves, in our lives, and frankly, in our families, or whatever social or kinship or non-kinship based spheres that we start with? Because I think unless we can actually practice that, we have no fucking clue how these models of self and family work outside of our culture. I'm, as someone who has always grown up within two cultures, what is really obvious to me is that cultures do not understand each other unless you have inhabited their practices well enough to understand it from the inside. And that takes years or decades to get to that. And I think it's worth putting forth that time in like the disastrous ruin of what a white Western nuclear family has become and has done to the planet.
I very much appreciate what you're saying, Catherine, about how the resistance to the imposition of family and of proprietarian kinship on populations sort of sparking and catalyzing a politics of family in retaliation and in and as a means of survival, right? This is also what I'm saying. You know, while I completely disagree that abolition of the family has been done before historically, I think in many ways we're coming from the same place, and I think sharing, you know, materially overwhelmingly the same concerns. It doesn't seem helpful to me, as I argue, you know, in the book, to call practices like, you know, family separation at the border of settler colonies, you know, family abolition. It's sort of the opposite, right? I try and make the argument that it is yes, exactly, definitionally sort of racial, definitionally bourgeois sort of technology of the family as a social order that leads to these practices in the first place, right? And so, I mean, I suppose maybe you're saying that you know, abolition is an overly abstract or academic sort of formula, this sort of Aufhebung mechanism of simultaneous, you know, destruction, preservation, and transformation that we're talking about, and which I argue is, you know, and this is something I think I disagree with slightly some other family abolition comrades with, because I do think it is the same basic horizon and imaginary as with something like prison abolition. Point being, you know, that there is something that we are, you know, across populations gaining from a sort of conceptual, you know, dream in the context of, you know, the criminal justice system, the you know, the travesty at the core of it is about justice, right? About accountability. The existing, you know, what is delivered by that thing in the present is a travesty. It's the opposite, right? But by understanding what keeps our attachment to it, we become capable of not simply imagining abolition as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says, you know, deleting and taking away, but on the contrary, shifting our attention away from the supposed subject, right? In this case, you know, the literal prisons, but the world which makes them thinkable, and the world which makes it possible to feel that we need them. And it's the same for me with family. You know, it's not at all about like starting inside the you know, the house and the relationships in there necessarily. Of course, that needs to be spoken about too in the process of you know, revolutionary sort of abolition of the self. But for me, family abolition is, and I think it has been mostly for, you know, throughout the history of this horizon, a question of building the world in which we might not need the family, in which we would not need the family. And that's it, right? And which makes it a pretty sort of, in a sense, you know, practically mundane sort of thing, you know, like universal free healthcare, shelter, provision of food, you know, provision of space, provision of, you know, it's you know, that's what it is, you know. So yeah, I don't know if other people have further sort of ideas about how this. Oh, I see there's something in the chat from Alex. But
yeah, I think also we'll distribute the chat since there's a lot of responses as you're speaking that are coming in. So yeah. Yeah, so I mean, we can close by continuing this thread, but maybe there are a couple other questions. Do you feel like you have the bandwidth to respond to a few others, Sophie? Yeah, okay. So there was a question earlier from Josha. Do you want to ask?
Yeah, I'm happy to, yeah. It's a question to everyone, really. Thank you so much for the seminar and all your writing. It's been a great inspiration. I work in education. Something that struck me in the context of this seminar was the quote by Donna Haraway in the 4th chapter, where she says, "It's time to theorize an unfamiliar unconscious, a different primal scene, where everything does not stem from the dramas of identity and reproduction." And I was just wondering what people here who know more about this than me had to say. Any ideas, sort of, what could that be? We briefly mentioned attachment, but I think there are certainly some political critiques of that model as well. Yeah, and I was just wondering if anyone had any exploratory thoughts on what that scene might be.
Can I try to respond to that one? I mean, I think, like, I like the idea of the primal scene in the psychoanalytic vocabulary, because for Freud, very straightforwardly, the family, the pre-capitalist mythical family is the primal scene. Right? So you have this father complex and this mother complex, and you have this nuclear complex that is a psychical formation that is like somehow quasi-transcendent of any given historical or social formation of the family. And so you would be forgiven for thinking just outright, okay, well, then Freud just reifies the Western bourgeois family, and that's the end of the story, and we can move on. But there's something kind of on the other side of that, when you think about it long enough, I think, which is that as a primal scene, it's something that it's a way of rationalizing, or not even necessarily rationalizing, but Freud's myth of the family is a way that is an entity or a way of giving intelligibility to your life and to your earliest affective and interpersonal relations, that gets at not the positive form of the family, not the family as it ought to exist eternally, but of the conflicts that we know as Oedipal in the psychoanalytic vocabulary that make up the difficulties of forming attachments. Right, that you beseech a father to tell you who you are, that you beseech a mother to give you nourishment and care. Like, these moments in these conflicts, these dynamics make up the unconscious primal scene, or the structure of what it means to be in a familial relationship. And I completely hold out for the possibility that, should it be the case that material relations are communized, that a new primal scene might be set out. And it could very well be the case that we could historicize Freud to be mostly about capitalist family relations, taken to the scale or the pitch of a myth, right? But of course, Levi-Strauss's whole thing about myths and kinship structures and all this kind of stuff is that myths conceal material antagonisms. They resolve them in a kind of super ordinate way that gives you a narrative about what the family is, for instance, or what a society is, or what culture is, or how to resolve the difference between nature and culture, interiority and exteriority. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, we might have new myths. It's possible to have new myths. Like, it's not impossible that we would have new myths around familial care in a communized material situation. And so, but in that way, it would mean a new primal scene. And in that way, it would mean a new kind of unconscious. Now, again, the novelty of that remains to be seen. But I think, it's not impossible to imagine. I know that's like very tepid and kind of like frail way of putting it, but I can't assert too much else besides that.
It's very similar to what Tiffany Latavo King says at the front of her essay, isn't it? There are other ways of naming one another as relations. And even though it seems quite unsatisfactory on its face to not immediately fill in what that other way is, while allowing oneself to be inspired by existing modes, right? I hope that in both For Surrogacy Now and this book, I give a lot of care, love, and respect to the forms of embodiment otherwise, and practices of survival in the cracks, the skills that are developed in the interstices. You know, but I think it's also important to not necessarily see that as, you know, as a blueprint, right? Colonial utopianism is about the search for blueprints, and the building of a society on a sort of terra nullius of the mind, right? But critical utopianism, as you know, and decolonial utopianism is about an orientation of collective sort of practical denaturalization, a simple negationism of the natural shibboleths that are sort of given to us to orient our you know, our lives and ourselves. I think you know, I've become, you know, more confident since writing Full Surrogacy Now, that abolition really is the right word for what needs to be done with the family. And I had moments of you know, non-conviction in that regard over the last few years. And I used to say, you know, because of how unpleasant it is really to upset people like this all the time. I used to say, don't worry, I mean real families against the family, you know. But I think actually it's looking at you know, the Indigenous and Black revolutionaries of the archive that I was looking at that made me realize that there is nothing for us there. There's that being recognized as a family by the state and by capital it is not a good enough horizon. It's not a good horizon at all, arguably. And I will just sort of, you know, keep insisting really that while it makes complete sense to feel and indeed be defensive and protective of the forms of nurture, and yes, indeed, you know, non-egoic, you know, partially sort of non-proprietarian and collectivized social reproduction that exist in sort of alternative structures. You know, side note, the family isn't embodied in, right? Like, just to say, I hope I say that enough in the book. It's not like people are really out here doing that. Like, who? Like maybe one or two. See, like it's an order, right? Like that image isn't somehow incarnated everywhere, right? It doesn't, but that doesn't mean that, you know, its fictiveness doesn't mean that it's not materially kind of up in all of our business, you know, like defining value production on a global scale. But I think, yeah, I think it's, you know, it's important to keep kind of like doggedly and almost like childishly repeating, you know, that this place that is supposed to be a haven is where you are most likely to be murdered. It's where you are most likely to be raped. It's where you're most likely to be abused, right? Just surely there is, you know, another way. And insisting on it being about the privatization of care, I think is very clarifying in this regard, because it means that it does apply, you know, to all kinds of different populations who you know, nevertheless are, you know, under the rule of capital, you know. None of us really escapes that, and so the horizon is extremely totalizing, and I understand how, yeah, the problems that one might have with that, but I guess I stick to it. And thank you so much for the challenges and the conversation that we've all had today, which I found extremely generative.
Thank
I
you.
think that's a
Yeah.
very good note to end on.
I think so too. Yeah. I just want to remind everyone before we go, first of all, thank you, Sophie, so much for sharing your book with us and for your really generous responses to all these challenges and questions. We'll again try to save the chat, and just a reminder that on September 4th, we'll have the release for Emmy's book, and we hope you can all come. So I'll just put the link again to, hold on. to our lectures, and then you can register immediately for Emmy's event.
My book is an effort to depict a family abolitionist future. And it draws a lot from Sophie's thinking and other reading. And, you know, there's some controversy about what does it mean to try to depict this, to represent it, but it might create some rich discussion for us if some of you all were able to come to the release, the launch.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for participating so much in the big group format. This was really generative. Thanks. Okay.